finally get to wear your Dodgers paraphernalia.
I know, it's the new World Series.
Yeah, that I saw it was a new one. It's been a long time. When my husband was stationed in Southern California, when we lived there, he had just got back from Gulf War, and in Southern California, they allowed any military people to go to Disneyland and all that stuff, either for free or really. And Dodger Stadium, if you had a military ID, you got them free. I can't even tell you how many Dodgers games we went to. We went to a lot of Dodgers games.
Cubs are the way to go.
All right, folks, let's close up our laptops, focus up here for just a few minutes. We are going to continue our look at, through section 1, groups of people, minorities that faced discrimination. And you read about Jim Crow laws and also Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court case that legalized segregation. And again, I know that court case one was maybe a little difficult to read, but I like you to see that language that those judges actually used. And what Plessy versus Ferguson does is it legalizes segregation. And I think that's important to know, that while and when that becomes the norm in the South, it is not unconstitutional. It is not illegal to segregate, to have separate schools, to have African Americans not being able to enter except through back doors and those kinds of things. So we're going to look at two men today that worked towards changing the lives of freed slaves. And the first one is Booker T. Washington. And again, he is the most famous leader of that 19th century. Lots of things named after Booker T. Washington. I think the alternative school in Vigo County, I think it's still named Booker T. Washington, but I don't know if they merged Booker T. Washington and McLean into one school. I'm not sure. The important thing to know about the difference between Du Bois and Booker T. Washington was that Booker T. Washington was a slave. He was born into slavery. He was a slave. And so obviously his background definitely impacts the way he makes decisions and the way he sees life. And so Washington believed that Black citizens should accommodate themselves to segregation. And remember when we had this conversation, a couple of why lots and lots and lots of white people like Booker T. Washington, but not a whole lot of Black people. It will be very interesting to, if you want to take this task, is to find out where those Booker T. Washington high schools are located. You won't find a lot of Booker T. Washington high schools located in predominantly African American communities because of that very first statement. Accommodate themselves to segregation. In other words, we should be happy and thankful that we're at least allowed to go to public school, or that we can get into the movie theater. Build up their own economic resources through hard work. So the way that African Americans can begin participating is through hard work. Establishing reputations as hardworking and honest citizens. The one thing, again, and the reason why many schools are named after Booker T. Washington is his idea of offering vocational education, which is Booker T. Washington and Vigo County started out as a vocational school. And again, it's one of the things that Du Bois is going to be really against him. Vocational school is doing things with your hands. And again, not being dismissive of a vocational education, but if that's the only thing you were offered. So when you started high school, the only classes you could take were the health and careers classes, Mr. Ledun's robotic classes, Mr. Pianadosi's woodworking classes, or automotive. That's the only opportunity you had for classes. For some of you, that might be awesome. For many of us, me, That would not be anything I would be good at. There's no way I could take health and careers. Zero way. Zero way. That does not appeal to me at all. Mr. Ledune's class? Probably. Mr. Pianadosi's class? Nope. I mean, not that I wouldn't want to take it, but for me, if that was the only thing, and that's what Du Bois is going to say. When you only offer a certain type of education, you're limiting the success of individuals. So that's Booker T. Washington. W. Du Bois is going to definitely disagree. Du Bois was a PhD from Harvard, not born into slavery. And he says straight away, freed blacks demand full equal rights as provided by the Constitution. That is what the Constitution says immediately. And the last one is, again, one of the statements that at the time, white people did not feel very comfortable with. Du Bois felt the burden of achieving equality did not rest on the shoulders of African Americans. We don't have to do this. We don't have to work to prove this. This is for society to accept us, not for us to work to be in part of society, but for all of us to be part of society. And so he obviously is not as well accepted into the conversation as Washington would be. Ida B. Wells, again, disagreed with Washington's methods. Wells was also born into slavery. She becomes a teacher and saved up her money and bought a newspaper called Free Speech. And after witnessing a lynching of close friends, she writes an editorial attacking lynching. She spends the rest of her life writing, speaking, protesting about lynching. And again, the specifics of lynching mean that the person who is going to be hanged did not have due process. There was not an arrest. There was not charges filed. You're being arrested for this reason. There was not a trial in front of a jury, and then you were punished. A group of people took it upon themselves to be both judge and jury and punishment as well. Most often, all of these lynchings were young African American men who had been accused of some kind of impropriety with white women, some kind of sexual overture, being accused of any types of molestation, rape, etc. And it, again, is a very, very dark moment in the history of the United States that lynching was allowed and continued for as long as it did. We're going to look at two other groups that we don't often mention when we look at discrimination, and that, again, is Chinese. We did a little bit when we talked about building the railroad. Chinese immigrants face racial prejudice in the West at this time. The United States passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, banning all Chinese from entering the country. And in 1886, Yik Ho versus Tompkins sided with a Chinese immigrant to overturn the law that banned Chinese from operating laundries. Again, the idea that a state would say Chinese people are not allowed to participate in an industry and just ban them totally from that industry certainly does not seem very democratic, and that lawsuit allowed Chinese to operate laundries. And that becomes a very stereotypical industry that Chinese will participate in. And mostly the reason being is because it was one of the few things that they were allowed to participate in. And lastly, a group of Americans that really get lost in the discussion of discrimination are Mexican Americans. Mexican Americans become Mexican Americans in the late 1840s, early 1850s, when the United States goes to war with Mexico. The United States goes to war with Mexico, and in defeating Mexico, gains territory that is New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California into Nevada. And that instantly becomes United States territory. All of those Mexicans who were Mexican nationalists that lived there now instantly became American citizens. They were given, obviously, the opportunity to return to Mexico. Most of them did not want to leave. That was their home. And so they become citizens in a very, well, I shouldn't even say citizens. They become part of the United States in a way that had no part of their doing. They didn't come, they didn't seek out. That was where they lived. And as part of a war, they were put into a different country. So in the Southwest, 4 out of 5 Mexican Americans lost their land after the Mexican-American War, despite a treaty. And I do not speak Spanish. The Las Gorras Blancas, which is the actually literal translations, the hat whites, is a Mexican-American group that fought for their rights by inflicting property damage on landowners, publishing their grievances in their own newspapers. And so that group, again, will struggle with their own discrimination. And lastly, we are still working on these women's rights. Prior to the Civil War, women played a large role in reform movements, including the call to abolish slavery. Leaders wanted further rights of women and are incredibly disappointed when women were not included in the 14th and 15th Amendments. And so Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton formed, the National Women's Suffrage Association in 1869 to work towards an amendment to guarantee women the right to vote. What happens with movements such as the Civil Rights Movement, Mexican-American movement, women's movement, is that every single one of these movements starts in the same way. It starts with exactly what we did in the Revolutionary War. It starts with legislative petitions, signing things, submitting things in writing. We want to do this. We all sign this petition, the declaration. We sign, petition our government, and that only gets so far. And what essentially happens with every single movement that eventually becomes successful, it has to take a different tone. It has to move to what historians call a more militant movement. The civil rights movement under Martin Luther King only goes so far. It's not until it moves under the militant activity of the Black Panthers, Malcolm X, that anything changes. The women's rights movement, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they write letters, they sign petitions, they put editorials, they show up in the offices of Congress in their hats and gloves, and they make nice, and it doesn't change anything. And until we move to Alice Paul and Lucy Stone and those women who are going to make signs, chain themselves in front of the White House, get arrested, go on hunger strikes, that anything ever changes. And so these are the things that will need to be fixed as we move into the 20th century. Susan B. Anthony will vote. She's arrested. She will vote. She's arrested. She'll vote. She's arrested. She tours the nation, delivering a powerful, powerful speech on this issue, when women will not secure suffrage during the 19th century. We go into the 20th century before women have or are able to gain the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony will be one of the first women to recognize that there is opportunity in being arrested. There is not opportunity in being arrested. If you're just a regular kid, don't do it. But if you're an activist, there is opportunity in being arrested because it draws attention to your cause. And so that will be the cause that women will use in that. So how were civil rights and political groups undermined during the years of Reconstruction? Equal rights extended to African Americans were narrowed, and the move away from equality had a long-lasting impact on society in the United States. All right, so you have a short reading on both Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Their worksheets on Kami. I think I added a third page. It should open to a blank page where you can answer. Please don't try to answer the question actually on the worksheet with a little text box because there's no room. So I think I was successful in adding a third blank page for you to put your answers on that. The first one, I think you are reading about comparing and contrasting because that is one of the important tasks in looking at those two people, compare and contrast. That is it for the day. Does anyone don't forget to turn your bell questions in, those of you that are finishing those up today. Any questions about anything? All right.